Good morning. I'm Bill Collier. I'm here from Port Townsend, travel far from Port Townsend. Thanks to Larry for picking me up. And thank you guys for inviting me. It's just fun to do this. So I'm going to talk about the greatest adventure any pilot could ever have, I think, because Air America was an incredible adventure. It was a tremendously interesting and demanding flying. And it was a little bit dangerous, but it was nothing like Vietnam when I flew for the Marine Corps in Vietnam. Getting shot at in Vietnam was a daily occurrence. In Vietnam, in Air America, I worked in Laos, and I only got shot at 2 or 3 times in 30 months. Here's the map of the area, and if you look at that, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the red line. The North Vietnamese were sending all the supplies down. This country of Laos was a neutral country, but the North Vietnamese just took it upon themselves to take over eastern Laos, and they made the Ho Chi Minh Trail to bring all the supplies down to the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army in South Vietnam. So initially, the North Vietnamese tried to take over all of Laos. In 1961 or 62, the Laotian government asked the U.S. government for help, and we sent in a squadron of Marine H-19s, the predecessor to the H-34. And the Marine Corps squadron stayed there and helped the Laotians fight off the North Vietnamese. And then later, the company was acquired by Air America, and it was all the pilots who worked for the Marine Corps had the option of staying with Air America, the civilian company, and most of them did. So basically, we're talking about a whole squadron of Marine Corps helicopters and Marine Corps pilots working in Laos. And our idea was, when this part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail happened, 300,000 civilians were displaced from their homes. These are people right off the cover of National Geographic magazine, and they had black pajamas, conical hats. They didn't quite have bones in their noses, but it was the only metal they had. They had machetes, they had cooking pots, and they made their own handmade single-shot flintlock rifles so they could hunt. I should have brought one. I've got it. I should have brought it. I didn't think to bring that. Probably couldn't have brought it on the ferry. Anyway, so
that'd be dangerous.
What Air America was about was helping the Laotian people fight off the communists coming from the north. They were mostly coming this way. Now I've got a better map here, a more close-up map. So Air America was theoretically not part of the government. It was a separate, controlled private entity. That's always what they always say. But it's not true. It actually was owned by the government, and it's been proven in court. It's been taken to court and proven in court that Air America actually was a government entity. We had a lot of pilots who had retired from the Navy and the Air Force and the Army. After the retirement, they went to work for Air America, and they were damn good pilots. They should have got additional retirement pay for their time at Air America. And it's been held up in Congress. It's still in committee in Congress after 40 years. They're waiting for all the old guys to die off so they don't have to pay them a few $100,000 each, probably tens of thousands of dollars each. It's really not an enormous amount of money at all. Okay, here's the map. If you look carefully, in the northern part of Laos, if you can see the red hash marks, that's what the North Vietnamese controlled. But in the middle of Laos, right there was this place called the Plain of Jars. Anybody ever heard of the Plain of Jars? Most people haven't. This plain was at 4,000 feet above sea level. It was about 40 miles square, and it was covered with thousands of big stone jars. The jars would be this high and this big around. They weigh thousands of pounds, and they're made of stone that came from 40 miles away, and they're so old, even the local people do not have traditional myths about where these came from and what they were for. They've been there for so long. But thousands of these jars are laying in there. The theory is there were burial urns. They're big enough to put a couple bodies in, and some of them had lids.
What about grain storage?
Nobody knows for sure what they were there for, but why would they bother to transport stone from 40 miles away? I mean, how did those ancient people transport something that weighed 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 pounds? How did they carve it out of solid basalt and move it out to these plains? So it's a real mystery, but that's why it was called the Plain of Jars. The green circle there pretty much roughly defines the Plain of Jars. And the North Vietnamese and the Laotians went back and forth controlling the plain. Finally, by the time I got there, the North Vietnamese actually controlled the Plain of Jars, but we had operations out there. We'd do inserts and insert spy teams and such. So I flew for the Marine Corps in Vietnam. I think you all know that. And that was quite an experience. I flew the H-34, and who mentioned earlier about the throttle. In a recip helicopter, if you want to climb, in the newer helicopters, they'll have a governor. If you want to go up, you just pull up on the collective pitch, and that collectively changes the pitch of the blades. If you do that in a turbine helicopter, the governor automatically increases the engine power. In a recip helicopter, when you increase the pitch on the blades, you've got to wrap on some throttle, or otherwise your blade is going to slow down, you're going to stall. On the contrary, when you want to slow down or go down, you reduce collective pitch, so you reduce lift. You've got to roll throttle off. So it's a very delicate balance and then as soon as you add throttle, you change rudder because of the torque involved. When you do that, that changes the attitude a little bit, so you got to adjust the stick a little bit. So it's like this ongoing dance in the air. You constantly got both your feet going, your hand go, and this hand going up and down and round like that all the time, and then talking on two radios, and now controlling other buttons. So it's challenging to fly a helicopter. So I got out of the Marine Corps in 1968 in Southern California. How much time have I got anyway?
As much as you want.
Yep.
Yeah? Oh, good. Now, I've cut this down from 5 hours to 3, so we're okay. So I got out in 68, and I don't know how many here will remember 68, 69, but boy, the airlines were furloughing by the droves. I had friends in reserves who hired, trained, flew, and then laid off sequentially by the three major airlines at the time, Pan Am, TWA, and American United, I forget. They just couldn't, nobody could hold a job. So a friend and I hired an employment agency and sent our resume all around the world to every airline. Well, one of the things I got back was an application from this funny company called Air America. I knew that was CAA. I knew I'd have to go back to the war if I applied to them, so I didn't want to go. But I filled out the application anyway, just in case. You never know. I might need a job in a couple of years. Well, about a year later, I was desperately in need of a job. I spent a summer in Alaska flying on the North Slope, hauling surveyors around for the exploration phase of the North Slope. And at the end of that summer, we went out to the end of the Aleutian chain and worked for the Atomic Energy Commission on underground atomic testing. Way out the Aleutian chain, almost inside of Russia, is an island called Kamchatka. And they put a bomb 4,000 feet underground and set it off and did an experiment. They couldn't do atomic testing in the air anymore because they were getting strontium-90 and all kinds of radiation all over the world. So they started doing underground testing. It's fortunate we stopped doing that too. So,
Tried to move the U.S. further from Russia.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I found interesting was the island of Kamchatka. After the bomb, they had to rename the island because it's now called Amka because they blew the shit out of it. So anyway, I had a good friend who acted sooner than I did on the telegram that I got. I got this telegram, and I sat on it for about 6 months. Interested in employment in Southeast Asia, called this guy Dawson, H.H. Dawson Collect. I sat on it for 6 months, but my good buddy Gary did it right away. He went over there, and we corresponded. And he kept telling me, Bill, this is really a good deal. Come on over. So I applied, and they hired me, and I went over there. And this is, I like to show this because I was writing to my friend, and I sent him a letter, and it was just a one-word letter. I said, Dear Gary, inbound, Bill. His reply was, Bill, ETA, Gary. That was our whole exchange of letters for that series. So I got over to Udon. We lived in Udon, Thailand. which is just south of the capital of Laos, in Vientiane. And we lived right about here. And we would fly into Laos. And the company had about 6 bases. One here, one here in Pak Se, one here in Savannah Ket, one in Vientiane, one at Luang Prabang, and one at Ban Hui Sai. So whenever we went, the company had leased the old French hostels, and they had like a hotel for us. So we'd go there, and they had to make our food for us. We had maids and servants, and it was nice. So we didn't have to worry about a place to live or staying in hotels or anything. So we'd go out and we work 6 days, and then we'd go home for a day. And then we go out for 6 more days, home for a day, 6 more days, home for a day, and then guess what? Any Vietnam vets there? You know what R&R is? Everybody knows what R&R is. With Air America, we got all of our flight time in about 3 weeks. So guess what? We had R&R every month. And I was making really big bucks. Adjusted for inflation to today's money, I was making about $275,000 a year.
Nice.
Wow. That blows me away.
Did you save any of that?
I didn't, actually. A long story. I can't explain it all because I got very depressed. But I came back from Vietnam with a bad case of post-traumatic stress, and I had to just keep changing things. I kept changing jobs. That's why I like to bill myself as the world's most experienced helicopter pilot, because I've changed jobs about 20 times. I worked for, I think, 13 different major entities. I worked in about 13 different countries, 47 different states. I've traveled around a lot and spent several months in Saudi Arabia, 2 years in the South Pacific working on the U.S. Army missile testing program. That's all in my 3rd book about the rest of the story, because today I'm mostly talking about Air America. So I got the telegram, I responded, I got hired. 90 days later, I'm a captain. Look at that, just like that. It's that easy. Because they had H-34s, that's why they hired us, because we had flown H-34s in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. So by the time I got to Air America, flying an H-34 in quasi-combat was a whole lot easier than what we did. And after I'd been there for a while, I had a chance to convert over to Hueys. And some of our Hueys were registered in Laos. And they, instead of November, they had X-ray whiskey. You can see on the cover of my book here, the helicopter has X-ray whiskey, Papa Fox Hotel. That's the registration number of it. So I had to get a Laotian pilot's license. How many people do you know have a Laotian pilot's license? Here's the inside of it. The company did a lot for me. I didn't have to do a thing. So I flew the H-34, a good machine. I really enjoyed it. It was really built like a truck. We could abuse it. We could land it hard. We could turn it on a dime and just really abuse the hell out of it, and it wouldn't break. It was a great machine, and it was great big oleo struts. It was great big fat tires. We could come into a hot zone, plant that tail wheel and let it kind of drag us down and let it fall through. And when it fell through, the big struts and the big fat tires would absorb all the so we could drive it in hot and hard. In Vietnam, we did that a lot of times. We'd come into a hot zone, we'd come in really fast, we'd throw it up and basically split the needles and make it a vertical auto rotation, and just use the whole entire rotor disc as an air brake, like that. And then as it slowed down, began to fall through, we'd get control, bring the throttle back on, and just touch down. So we abused it really hard. When the Marine Corps started phasing out the H-34, they brought in the C-Night, the H-46, the smaller version of the Chinook. So the pilots who had flown the H-34 in Vietnam started flying the C-Night like they flew the H-34. They'd come into a hot landing zone, they'd flare it up like that, and they'd get halfway sideways, and they'd turn on something in their aft rotor system had something called hover aft, which would make the back half of the aircraft act like a speed brake and would slow them down. Would also rip the entire back half off the aircraft. Just ripped them apart. And so they beefed it up. Where it came apart, they beefed it up. Guess what? The next station, it came apart there. The next station, it came apart there. Finally, they took them all in the shop and beefed up the whole fuselage so it couldn't come apart when it landed hard or got overstressed. But then they didn't take care of the transmission mount. It was only 3 bolts. Once in a while, one would get a little loose, it would start to work, and then that transmission would depart the helicopter. As it did, all the blades were synchronized so they didn't hit each other. As soon as they started to come apart, the drive shafts would ruin, and the blades would hit each other, and the whole thing would come down out of the skies. It was awful. It was a terrible machine. The main reason I didn't stay in the Marine Corps, I did not want to go back to Vietnam in that machine.
A friend of mine at flight school, his first flight in an active squadron with the CO had the CH-46 twist in half like that.
Yeah.
First one. He survived it, but...
I had a friend who, when I came back, I was working in a group staff office, and one of my squadron mates down the hallway had been in one of those crashes where they were just touching down to land, and next thing you know, he knows he's sliding down the runway, still strapped in his seat, sliding down the runway. The machine just came apart and shook him down the runway. He got a broken back, and that's why he was doing the legal office instead of flying. So the interesting part about the H-34 is that it's made out of magnesium. It's really hard to ignite, but once it ignites, that entire machine is gone in 15 seconds. So we had to be really careful about fire. I never had one burn up on me, but almost every place in Vietnam when one got left behind, either the enemy came and threw a satchel charge in it, or the military came and burned it with napalm to get so the enemy couldn't get into it.
They built it that way for weight purposes, or?
Yeah, it's light.
Yeah, magnesium is light, very light. It was magnesium and aluminum alloy. It was really hard to ignite, but once it did, there was no putting it out. It'd be gone. I actually watched one night in Vietnam when one of my squadron mates got hit by friendly artillery. They burned up in about 10 seconds, 5 guys, and the whole aircraft was gone, and 5 guys were gone. It's pretty grim.
Good design for combat airplane.
Now, in the Laotian area, flying over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the Air Force had these little Cessna 01 bird dogs, and they were called Ravens. In Vietnam, they had a different name. In South Vietnam, they had a different name. But where we were, they were called Ravens. And they would fly down low and slow, searching around the Ho Chi Minh Trail, looking for ammunition dumps, fuel dumps, truck parks, whatever they could find that the enemy had stowed that was on its way down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And then we'd call in bombers and bomb the hell out of them and destroy all those supplies to deprive the enemy of them. So if this guy was out there flying around, and it was very common if they made one circle, they'd fly around about 200 feet above the ground, down low and close to the enemy. And so when they would fly around, if they made one circle and went on their way, they're okay. The enemy said, okay, we haven't been spotted. If they made 2 circles, the enemy knew they'd been spotted and they'd start shooting. And I think there were 128 of these Ravens during the war in Laos, and I think like 28 of them were killed. Because they were just down there so low and slow, just brass balls that big. So one day, this fellow was flying out there over the plain of Jars. He in his 01 Bird Dog, Air Force pilot, and he got shot down. And he almost made it back to Luang Prabang, but then he crashed in the woods. Believe it or not, 2 people survived this crash. But just the pilot had a mildly broken arm. It wasn't even lacerated or anything, just a mild crack. In those days, the custom was when you rescued somebody, he bought you a bottle of booze. Well, when I got back to the base with this wounded pilot and his local observer, they stuffed him into an ambulance, and before I could even shut my engine down, they were gone. Damn, I wanted my bottle of booze. And sometimes if you talk to them, they can say, oh yeah, I lost my pistol in a crash too. Here, I have my pistol. So I didn't get a pistol or a bottle of booze. Darn it. So 34 years later, I'm standing on a street corner in Sonoma, California, which just happens to be my hometown. It doesn't mean to the story, but I'm waiting to go into the Catholic Church to go to the funeral of a CIA case officer I worked for. There was a guy named Tony Poe. If you've ever seen the movie Apocalypse Now, Colonel Kurtz, Tony Po was the role model for Colonel Kurtz. Way up in northwestern Laos, he was running his own private little army. He was really doing a lot of good. He was creating a lot of hassles for the North Vietnamese, and he was killing a lot of enemy soldiers. And he was paying a bounty to his soldiers. Bring me back the left ear of the guy you killed, and I'll pay you a bounty. So he started doing that. And it was pretty effective for a while. And I think at some time he had a whole string of ears on his, hanging above his desk. But what happened one day, he was noticing in the village, he noticed that some of the kids had one of their ears missing. And he asked him why, and he said, oh, Daddy cut it off so he could get a bounty. So we stopped paying bounties on ears at that point. He didn't want the kids to be mutilated. So most of our work, a lot of our work, I talked about the 300,000 people that got displaced. They lived on the eastern part, on the western edge of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, eastern Laos. And when the North Vietnamese came in, it looked very much like if they stayed there, they would either be killed or enslaved by the North Vietnamese. They didn't want that. So the 300,000 people moved west into the mountains. And these are the kind of Hmong people. They live on the hillsides, they grow dry rice, and they hunt and they fish and they do okay. Very primitive. But we took it upon ourselves, our country, to support 300,000 people while they were getting resettled into their new homes west of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we'd carry rice and chicken and pigs and corn, and I think there was one 3-day period where I carried nothing out there but canned lobster Newburgh that some big company had donated. They were probably out of date or something. And then another time I did nothing for days on end but carried dried milk out to these villages way out in the woods. And the people out there, they'd get these foods and they'd try to eat them. They couldn't eat them. They were lactose intolerant. They couldn't eat milk. And then the lobster Newburgh was too rich. It made them sick. So guess what? They fed it all to their pigs. They had very healthy pigs. But the pigs, and then we threw them a curve there because one guy in charge of helping the people out, Pop Buell, if you've ever heard that name, he decided he would import Duroc pigs from Iowa and crossbreed with their pigs to make them bigger and healthy and get more meat. Well, that worked really well, except the local people were used to eating their pork raw. Ooh. And when we brought in the Duroc pigs, we brought in trichinosis, which they never had before. So that backfired just a little bit. Right. So anyway, this guy, Michael, got shot down. I rescued him, took him back to the base. 34 years later, I'm at the Catholic Church in Sonoma. And a guy walks up to me and he saw my Air America hat and he said, Air America, huh? I said, yeah. He said, he was a Raven. He was Raven 1-2 in Laos. Oh, hey, did you know Raven 1-1? Yeah, he's a friend of mine. He connected me 34 years later with the guy that I rescued, who is now senior captain with Continental. And we corresponded back and forth a little bit. And he came to visit me in San Francisco. He brought me a bottle of Johnny Walker Blue. Oh, that was such good scotch, oh my God.
There should have been 2 or 3 bottles by then.
Well, I brought my friend who was with me at the funeral. He brought his friend who introduced us. So the 4 of us sat, and we drank that bottle of Blue, and we drank a couple more bottles of booze, and we drank several bottles of wine. We had about this much Chinese takeout over 13 hours. My daughter got it all on videotape. I then took the videotape and some documentaries that I had about helicopter flying and gave them to an editor. And on YouTube, you'll find the rescue of Raven 1-1. And it's a story of the rescue when I rescued that guy. It's only about 25 minutes. It's a good story. So that's in my book, too. The Laotian soldiers, and we started hiring Thai mercenaries, too, because we pretty much used up all the Lao people between 12 and 60 because we had the hell of a war going on there. So we started hiring Thai mercenaries, paying them to be up there with the Laotians. But they had this custom, some kind of religious thing that they did, where they had to sacrifice a live water buffalo. Couldn't be dead. And how do you deliver a live water buffalo to an outpost on a hilltop? You can't put it in a helicopter because it'll just get excited or scared and run around and ruin everything. So what we do is we put them in, lay down one of those cargo nets on the ground, and we put the water buffalo in the middle of the net and shoot it with a tranquilizer dart. It would go on its knees, They'd gather the net up around it and then pick it up like that, and we could take it up to the outpost. And as soon as we delivered it, they would take the net off, and they'd take it over and kill it and eat it. But it had to be live when it arrived. So that was part of their...
They eat mules as well?
That was in Vietnam. I don't know the background in this story. It was just in the Air America log. But it was a good picture.
Yeah.
I don't think they eat the mules. I think that someone was just transporting the mules. So way up in the just south of the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the secret CIA base at Long Chen. If you look very carefully, you can see the airstrip right there. And it's down in a big bowl. The airplanes coming in, we brought C-130s, 123s, Pilacious Porters, every different kind of Twin Otters, everything into this place. They had to be in a pretty good descent to get down in the bowl, but as soon as they got to the runway, they had power because the runway was uphill. And they couldn't land long because at the end of the runway, there's a karst. So you didn't dare land long because you ran into that little mountain. So guys were very careful about landing. I did see the aftermath one day of a local Lao pilot. The local Laotian Air Force had T-28s, and the guy came in hot. He didn't want to run into the karst, so he turned, and he ran into a concrete block building, went through it, killed him, destroyed the airplane, but at least you didn't hit the karst. So if you look at this ridge here, this is called Charlie Ridge. And before it is another ridge. The Plain of Jars is out here. The North Vietnamese actually took over the Plain of Jars. They got over that first ridge, and they actually got a few people up on top of the second ridge. But the local Laotian people were able to fight them off, and the biggest determining factor was there's a small dirt road that came down the hillside from the other side down to the valley there. And it was only dirt, and it was just barely wide enough for a tank, and it had a cliff on both sides, so you couldn't go up or down. And the CIA officer in charge had the presence of mind to put a couple of anti-tank mines there. So 2 tanks came down, they blew up, they got destroyed, they blocked the road. The North Vietnamese army couldn't walk down that road. And by the time they got to the second ridge here, they were not trained for mountain warfare. And they didn't have a very good supply chain. So by the time they got to the Skyline Ridge there, they were hungry, they were tired, and they were thirsty, and they were exhausted, and they weren't very good fighters. And then what happened also is the CIA case officer happened to know that right over that first ridge there was a gathering. There was a whole entire North Vietnamese regiment there getting ready to come over the hill. The CIA case officer took a chance because it was pretty close to the friendlies, but he took a chance and called in a B-52 Arclight strike, and they were right on. They totally decimated an entire North Vietnamese regiment, just turned them into red mist. And the general in charge said, "I'm beat, I'm going home," and he took his troops and went back to North Vietnam. So that was very contested. And most of our work, when I worked in this area, the big airplanes would bring in the supplies, and we'd unload them here. Where's that airstrip? We'd unload them here. All day long, we would just fly them by helicopter by external load. We would just make trip after trip after trip after trip after trip, just supplying all these outposts. They had 155 howitzers, and we brought them. We actually had Chinooks there for a while, and Chinooks brought them entire pallet loads of ammunition. And we brought them all the food and supplies, and even one time the CIA was denying that we carried prostitutes out to them, but I actually did it. Didn't partake.
Bring any back?
They all came back. I didn't partake, but here's a little better picture of the airstrip and the karst and the ridge. And there's another perspective on it. So it was very challenging work. But sometimes we'd fly 11, 12 hours a day. We'd fly from first light to dusk and go back to Vientiane for the night. It was about a half an hour flight back to Vientiane. And here's the pictures of all the various outposts that were up on Charlie Ridge. and each one has a Charlie Delta, Charlie Tango, so on. Just that's what held off the North Vietnamese. It was a pretty exciting time. It was a lot of fun. The flying was challenging, but not as near as dangerous as Vietnam. Now I can pass this around. I'll start up here. One day I was flying with this guy, and late in the day, in Vietnam we learned not to go out and do stuff low and slow late in the day because we would get shot at. The enemy knew they could shot at us because it was getting dark, and we couldn't bring in the bombers right away, so we'd have to try not to fly out. When Laos, this guy I was flying with, we had a lost platoon of locals out in the south edge corner, east corner of the plain of Jars. And his team had been routed and they were running. He wanted to try to find them. He said, let's go find them. Well, that required flying low and slow over the trees. Well, guess what? We got shot full of holes. One bullet came up through the floor. I wasn't wearing this at the time. It was on the floor beside me right there. The bullet came through the helicopter, through the fuel cells, through the floor, through my clipboard, hit me right in the back of my seat, and would have penetrated and hit me right in the back of my heart area. The bullet jacket stayed here in this. The bullet continued to go on, went through my seat, hit my armor plated and skittered up between the seat and the armor plating, hit something else, and went through my overhead. And there was a hole in my overhead about that big enough to stick my head through. And fortunately, somehow, the bullet didn't penetrate my seat, and it didn't hit my head as it went from the seat to the overhead. I don't know how that happened, but there's the clipboard and the bullet fragment.
So it didn't go on up to the rotor?
I didn't see any damage to the rotor. It probably didn't.
But what was the biggest airplanes you flew into that field there? 130s or something?
130s, yeah. 124s, 123s. We also had S-58Ts. I didn't fly the S-58T there because I wasn't senior enough. I flew them later in life. Well, here's how I got my start. Thought I went to Navy flight school, didn't you? And here's my last flight. Most people don't know that the first American that died in Vietnam died in 1954. In 54, the part of the deal we had with Vietnam during World War II is we promised this funny guy named Ho Chi Minh that if he would help us fight the Japanese, we would help him become independent and not be a French Indochina colony anymore. So we worked on that promise. He helped us fight the Japanese. And part of the problem before that was the Vietnamese were fighting off the French in this place called Dien Bien Phu. You've all heard of that, I'm sure. It was like Long Chen. It was down in the valley. The French held the low ground. They said, there's no way the enemy can ever hurt us if they take those surrounding mountains because they don't have artillery. Guess what? The enemy was able to bring artillery and drag it up these most impossible dirt jungle trails and get it to the tops of several hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu and pepper the French with artillery, seriously, to the point where the French pilots would not fly out there and drop stuff to resupply the French troops. They refused to go. Air America, I don't think it was called Air America at that time, but it was an Air America function, was flying these boxcars, and we were actually dropping stuff. And one of the guys, whose name was Earthquake Magoon, if you've ever seen the Steve Canyon comic strip in the newspaper about 50 years ago, 60 years ago, Steve Canyon was a big hero. There's actually some of this stuff documented. And Steve Canyon actually talks about Earthquake Magoon. Anyway, Earthquake Magoon was a great big guy. He was so big he couldn't wear shoes, so he flew barefoot everywhere he went. And he was a legend. He weighed about 300 pounds, and he was a damn good pilot. But in dropping off to the troops in Dien Bien Phu, he got shot down and died. And it's only been a couple of years ago that they found the crash and they found his remains and repatriated them. So it was pretty interesting. Where are we? All right, there's lots more. In the northeast corner of Laos, let's see, Haiphong, Hanoi is there, so it probably was here. there was a karst that stuck up like a finger. It was called Lima Site 98. And the government and the Air Force and the CIA all decided, hey, it'd be a really good idea to put a radar station there to help us direct the bombers into Hanoi and Haiphong. It was only about 140 miles away. So we didn't have anything close enough at that time. So they went out there, and I guess they used Army air cranes. I don't know how they did this, but they actually built a radar base on top of this finger-type mountain sticking up. And they were doing a good job. They were directing the bombers into Haiphong and Hanoi. Well, the North Vietnamese became aware of it, and they didn't like it. So they sent over, everybody know what an AN-2 is? Big, giant Russian biplane.
Oh.
Okay, big and carry a lot of weight, but it's really slow. Well, the North Vietnamese sent 3 of these over to bomb this radar site with just dropping mortars out of the AN-2. That was how they were bombing. They flew over and they dropped a few mortars. They didn't do any good. They didn't hit anything vital.
Missed the mountain.
Well, I think they hit the mountain, but they didn't destroy the radar, and they didn't destroy. There were 2 Air America helicopter pilots based there at the time. The pilots jumped in their helicopter, and they caught up. And a Huey can go faster than an AN-2. So they caught up with it. I've got to get that picture on my presentation. The crew chief took his AK-47 and went and shot down the AN-2. Then the pilot went up behind the second AN-2 and hovered over it and blew it out of the sky. The third one was too far away. They couldn't catch it, and it got away. But this created a huge international flap because theoretically we weren't supposed to be armed, and we weren't supposed to be doing combat. But we just had the first and only known, to me, air-to-air kill of an airplane by a helicopter. This is 68. It was before my time. But I flew with those guys later on. So there was an interesting little side effect there that we had air-to-air combat. We always had these rumors that the MiGs might come up from North Vietnam and try to strafe the Long Chien base, but I never heard a hint of it happening. So one day I got recalled. I'd been out only 2 days. Usually we were out for 6 days. And I was really puzzled. Why am I being recalled? I've only been out 2 days. My machine is fine. I don't have a family. There can't be a family emergency. But as I began going back to Udorn, I realized that there were dozens of airplanes coming back. Everybody was getting recalled back to the base. So when I got back, there was almost no place to park. It was that busy. So when we got there, we said, we were told, report to the base theater tonight at 6. Okay, I'm going to have some kind of briefing. And when we got to the base theater at 6, there were guys in there with these wands, sweeping for bugs, looking everywhere, make sure there weren't anybody eavesdropping. As soon as the meeting started, they locked the doors and posted a guard at each door. Wow, what's going on here? This is pretty exciting. What we learned was that the Strela missile, handheld heat-seeking missile, had been in Vietnam now for a couple of years, but it hadn't yet come to Laos. We learned at that meeting that it had come to Laos, and we should watch out for it.
Right.
How do you watch out for something then go from 0 to 1.2 Mach in about a half a mile and kiss your navel from the inside without even knowing it's there? So this spooked a lot of us because we didn't want to get shot down. And the fun part was, one of the fun parts was a lot of my buddies that I flew in Vietnam with had also gotten hired by Air America. So we had about 40 guys that I knew, mostly former Marines, that we had a very tight group there. And we knew we'd look out for each other if we had to. And I never had a problem getting a ride when I needed a ride. But now we had to worry about this missile thing. So my buddies and I all agreed, okay, we'll keep flying until somebody pops one of these missiles at us, and then I'm going to quit. Everybody said that. Well, about 6 months later, somebody finally popped one of those missiles. Somebody just saw it, and a very characteristic corkscrew smoke trail behind it. And somebody saw one shot up in the sky. It didn't go after any airplane, didn't shoot anybody down. But that was enough for me. I'd had it. I mean, talking about mortars and rockets and 50 calibers and 37 calibers and maybe MiGs and bad weather in Laos a lot. and I was flying co-pilot now for a bunch of guys who, you know how it is when you're a co-pilot, the other guy's an idiot, so. And when I was a captain, the other guy was an idiot. It's always that way. So when it came right down to it, in late 72, I quit and went home. Only one other guy quit with me. It was amazing. And it went on, and what nobody knew, of course, was just 3 months later, we signed the peace accords in wherever they were, Paris, I guess. And that basically shut down all the combat. It was, after then, it was all just doing support stuff and withdrawal stuff, pulling out our people, pulling out our equipment and our supplies, and vaporizing the operation. When it was all over, we just walked away, just like we did with the North Vietnamese or the South Vietnamese. We just walked away and abandoned them. We walked away and abandoned the Laotian people to the North Vietnamese. It was pretty sad. And we did that recently in Syria when we walked away from the Kurds. Very distressing.
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, we should never walk away from our allies. So it was great fun. My buddy, because we had R&R every month, my buddy and I teamed up with my best buddy from Vietnam. And he was senior to me, so he adjusted his time off to match mine. And we got a week off every month, and every year we got a month. Every month we got a week, and every year we got a month. And twice while I was there, we attached our week off on either end of our month off. So we ended up with 6 weeks off with pay and Pan Am and TWA benefits. We could go around the world for about $150. So we'd go up to the travel office, we'd get a travel ticket with Pan Am ticket with every stop written in, eastbound or westbound, and we'd just go to the Bangkok and we'd get on the Pan Am flight at about 11:30 or 12 at night, going wherever they were going. We didn't care. And as soon as they got airborne at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, most of the passengers, and there weren't very many, were asleep. So we'd go in the back, find the girls, they'd be all sitting in the back chatting with each other. We'd go back and chat it up with all the hostesses. By the time we got to our destination, we had dates. So we always had a date wherever we went. And I ended up with a whole list of Pan Am stewardesses, my address, fucking no matter where I went, I always had a date. So it was great fun. And as I said, we're making the big bucks, so
Life was good.
it was good. And it was a whole lot, I call it a 50 times better job than flying for the Marine Corps in Vietnam, because it was about 1/10 of the risk and 5 times the pay. Do the math. So in my first Air American reunion in Dallas in '87, we created this plaque. And it has the names of, I think, 242 people who died in service with Air America over 13 years. And sucker must weigh 800 pounds. It took about 8 of us to carry it and put it in place. But it honors all those people. Not all those people died in airplane crashes or getting shot at. Some just happened to die, I think, while they were in service. But most of them were air crew, a lot of pilots and a lot of crewmen. I was very fortunate while I was there that I was there 30 months, and I was amazed that only one helicopter pilot was killed while I was there. Where on the other hand, about once a month, an airplane pilot or crew or somebody would be killed somewhere out in the system. We had about, I know when I left we had 400 helicopter pilots. And we probably had that many fixed-wing pilots. We had the second biggest airline in the world. And that Long Chen was one of the busiest airports in the world at the time. And then in 2000, we had a reunion in Vegas when the CIA had, the assistant deputy of the CIA came to Vegas. And he awarded a medal to all Air America crew. So I got my medal, 243, that's the number of people who died in service. And so I've got that medal in my display case at home. All right, any questions at all? There's one.
Help me out on my history. Air America and Flying Tigers, did they have the same mission or different missions?
Time frame.
Well, the Flying Tigers was in China prior to our entering World War II. Claire Chenault created
They were involved in Vietnam, I think, somehow. I don't know how, but
I don't know either. I have heard that Mrs. Chenault was somehow interested and was an investor in the company or something, but as far as I know, it's all rumors. So, and I sort of feel like, in fact, that was the when the Flying Tigers flew over China, they carried with them gold chits. They had little bars of gold, and they also had little paper things, and it was written in many different languages. I have one of those flags with about 10 different languages on it saying, if you help this pilot, you will be rewarded. Well, that evolved to Air America, where everybody began to buy these big gold bracelets. And they were double chain, nice latch, and you get your name put on there. And for the price of gold, basically, I think my bracelet was 454 grams. I think I paid about, $454. I think it was $1 a gram at that point. And I carried my bracelet around for years. Finally got in a financial pitch and had to sell it. And needed the money to survive.
Weren't you guys also big on like Rolex watches or something?
Yeah, Rolex. So some guys will have a Rolex on the part of their chain or on the other wrist. I had one friend who twice went down into the village, got drunk, took some young lady, young Thai lady home, woke up in the morning, his gold necklace, his gold bracelet, his watch, and his wallet would be gone twice. I think he'd learned the first time.
Those big clay pots, are they still there, or were they destroyed?
They're still there, and they're not clay, they're granite.
Granite,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're there. There are thousands of them still there. If you look online, just look up the Plain of Jars.
Plain of what?
Plain of Jars.
Jars?
They're still there. What do you do with thousands of great big plots when you don't have a need for them? So they're just laying there. It was
So
amazing.
after Air America, you did board stuff back in the States then? Or,
After Air America, I came back to the States. I rejoined the reserves through the H-53. And then I started flying civilian all around. I spent 4 summers in Alaska, including the one before Air America with the atomic energy testing.
That was just before the pipeline build in Alaska?
Yeah, before they even put out the bids. That's what I was involved in, finding out what to bid on. And then later on, I flew logging and out of Ketchikan, fishery out of Dillingham, and worked on the intertie between Anchorage and Fairbanks, which I don't think they ever finished. And then,
Fairbanks.
yeah, they were trying to build an intertie between Fairbanks and.
I don't think they ever did either.
They put a lot of money into it.
Anyway.
I would carry 2 20-foot long I-beams. Each one weighed 2,200 pounds. I could carry 2 at once.
With that logging and that I-beam stuff, that's dangerous.
And then I would carry those beams across and just take them out in the field. And where they were building the intertie, they had the big machines to drive the pile drivers. And I would just take the beams out and lay them on the ground. But people said as I was flying through the sky, the beams would clang against each other. Clang, clang. And they could hear me coming for miles. I couldn't hear it because I'm up in the cockpit and the sound's behind me. I've got earplugs and a helmet on. And I didn't hear that noise. I could feel a little bit when they would bong against each other, but I didn't hear the noise. That was kind of amusing. Then they hauled hundreds of big I-beams out in the field, and most of them got driven into the ground. They're still there, I'm sure.
What are you flying or building right now?
What am I doing now?
What are you flying or building right now?
I am not flying or building right now. Nothing. I had my own H-34 that I got from Andy. Andy is the president of the American Legion in Cedarville Woolley. Have I got that right? Where's Andy?
Andy not here?
He was. Oh.
me,
Oh well.
Did you work around Continental Air Service at the same time they were working with Air America, Continental Air Service?
Yeah, we worked.
I worked for Continental Airlines, and we shipped a lot of stuff in all during that time for Continental Air Service.
Yeah, Continental Air Service was doing a lot of work,
Different equipment.
mostly pilacious porters is what they had.
C-46s
And C-46s, yeah. And I think maybe DC-3s.
Yeah.
But we worked parallel and side by side with them, and
Okay.
they needed a ride, we gave them a ride. One of the fun stories was talking about rescues of Air Force pilots. And a lot of the pilots would take off from Udon, Thailand, and cross Laos to bomb North Vietnam. To the Air Force pilots, Laos was just black. on their maps in their brains. There was nothing there. It was all enemy territory. It was scary as hell. It did not want to eject over Laos. Meanwhile, we're flying around. I'm flying around single pilot in an H-34 all over Laos. So these guys would get out there, and they'd get shot up, say, over North Vietnam. So going home to Udon, they couldn't make it, so they'd eject. And they'd come down, and one of our guys would see him come down or hear him calling on the radio and say, oh, there he is. In the meantime, the Air Force would launch 2 helicopters out of NKP or Udon to go rescue, their search and rescue 2 Jolly Greens. But they get to the border, and they couldn't cross the border until they had permission from the Pentagon. So they'd orbit at the border. Well, after a while, after they'd been orbiting for a while, they started getting low on fuel. They'd report that back to the base. The base would launch 2 more helicopters. And then they'd have 4 helicopters orbiting at the border, couldn't cross the border yet. So the Air Force can't have 4 helicopters in the sky without fighter cover. So then they launched 2 or 4 F-4s to protect the helicopters. And then pretty soon they're orbiting around at the border with all the 4 helicopters. And you can't have 8 aircraft in the sky without some command and control, so then they'd have somebody way up high who had command and control, waiting to get permission from the Pentagon to cross the border. So meantime, I'm out there, single pilot, and I'm just putzing around delivering rice to villages or whatever, and I hear the radio traffic, and I know I'm in the area, and I see a parachute coming down. I just go over and pick the guy up and take him home. The Air Force is appalled. You can't do that. Yeah, well, we just did it. It was just asinine at times. All war is. My experience in Vietnam and Laos has made me very anti-war. All right, so that was fun. What else can I talk about?
Tell us about your books.
My books, well, all right. My first book was Flying in Vietnam for the Marine Corps. Let's do this, get it on camera, yay. Vanna White here.
Swimsuit.
And that was a great adventure. I almost died several times there. Here, I'll tell this one great story in a minute. Then I went to work for Air America. Ta-da. And that was, you've heard that story, most of that story. And then the rest of my story, I wrote all about flying all around the world. In Alaska 4 summers, Saudi Arabia, South Pacific, working on the Army missile testing program, and all over the West Coast, and I got as far as Tennessee and Texas. So I've flown in about probably 30 different states, 17 different countries. And I think because I had a bad case of post-traumatic stress, I couldn't focus, I couldn't stay in one place, I couldn't commit, so I constantly kept changing things. So because of that, I flew about 40 different kinds of helicopters, had about 17 different jobs, and I like to consider myself the world's most experienced helicopter because I don't think anybody else did all that stuff.
You must have settled down enough to write some books.
Well, I did. Actually, when I went to Kwajalein to work on the missile testing program, it was a very small island of 3,000 people. It's a U.S. Army base. As the missiles come down, the Army leased to the atoll from the Marshallese government. So when I went there, I was told, yeah, there's a school, K through 12. There's a PX, there's shopping, there's hardware stores, there's bicycle shop, libraries, bowling alleys, the whole bit, like any small base. But I was told there are no stray women there. So I knew it was going to be a hardship tour. So I bought a word processor, and that's when I started writing my stories down in 1990. Turns out I latched onto a nurse, and we had a great time. So I didn't have to worry about being unaccompanied, but I did start my book then. It was going to be just one book, and eventually it just naturally divided itself into 3s. And I think there's a couple more budding off, a couple smaller versions budding off here and there.